Thanks for joining us today. I'm Cody Holyoke. There was a lot on the line in Kansas this election day, which is why today we are focused solely on the highly contested race for governor. The latest poll from a little more than a month ago shows incumbent Democrat Laura Kelly with a slight lead over her Republican challenger, State Attorney General Schmidt, though he is within the margin of error. So this is a statistical dead heat with a lot of undecided still in play. That means knowing where the candidates stand on the issues is critical moving into November. Today we'll hear from both of them in the order they responded to our request for an interview. We begin with Attorney General Schmidt, who recently sat down with us to make his pitch to Kansas voters. Thanks for joining us today.
Thanks for having me on.
Let's jump in. We saw a resounding defeat of the Value Them Both abortion amendment in August. Many people went to the polls, Republicans included, and said no, they didn't want the government getting involved. You have said that we should respect Kansas' decision, the voters' decision. As governor, if you get this job, would you be looking to add restrictions on abortion? What's your take on that issue?
Well, I am pro-life, and I prefer a Kansas future that has fewer abortions, not more. Voters did speak in August, and I think that decision must be respected. I think the focus going forward has to be on defending and protecting those existing regulations, most of which were adopted with bipartisan support, that are already on the books in Kansas. And that's an area of real contrast between my opponent and myself. What was not on the ballot in August was Governor Kelly's position on abortion. And she so far has refused to identify even a single restriction that she would support. That's concerning going forward in terms of defending those already on the books.
Would you support more restrictions, though?
I think the focus has to be on those already on the books. I think what is likely is that folks who oppose those already on the books are going to be bringing challenges in court, and I think that's where the focus really is going to be.
Much of your opponent's airtime has been trying to compare you to former Governor Sam Brownback and your support of his policies or moves made over recent years. What would you have done differently than the former governor, and how would you distance yourself from his administration and those policies?
Well, it's certainly true that my opponent has an unhealthy obsession with one of her predecessors. She spent a lot of time talking about things that were done by people who are not running for office this year. My position is that mistakes that may have been made by people many years ago are not what Kansans are worried about right now. They are instead worried about the mistakes being made by our current governor each and every day that have made their daily lives more difficult. And I think our focus has to be on how we go forward.
A worry for many families would be education, and we saw what the Kansas experiment did to schools and funding. Would you enact some of these similar tax cuts down the road if you need it in Kansas?
No, as I've always said, I think the numbers have to work. And obviously there's a constitutional obligation to properly fund schools. I successfully defended the legislation enacted when Jeff Collier was governor of Kansas to bring schools back into constitutional compliance. I think we have to stay in compliance. The challenge going forward is, now that we are in compliance, what can we do to better support kids and families and empower parents and put kids first? So much damage was done to so many of our children by the decision to lock them out of their classrooms. I talk to parents each and every day whose kids are still suffering the consequences of those decisions, mental health interventions, lowered student performance, kids who have chosen to leave the public school system because their parents became so frustrated with some of the misguided government policies during the lockdowns. And so I think that has to be our focus.
Let's talk about that a little bit, because you've really blasted your opponent for shutting the schools down, for instituting in-person learning or supporting those plans. What would you have done differently given the information at hand? We have more than 9,000 Kansans who have died from this virus.
You can look around at how other states handled this matter, and while every state was in a difficult spot very early in the pandemic, because nobody had been here before in March of 2020, but a lot of states learned so much more quickly. My opponent was the first governor in the country to lock schools statewide down for the balance of the school year in 2020. That included schools in the western part of our state where there were no reported cases of COVID at that point. She then kept them closed through the summer and tried to keep them closed into the fall of the next year, and the State Board of Education put a stop to that. So I think in hindsight, looking back from the standpoint of other states that handled this matter much more effectively, I think, for example, Florida, I think that's a good illustration, Missouri also in many cases, I think that it's clear that the lockdowns were an overreaction as they were extended.
Let's talk about a national campaign issue that your campaign has made very much a Kansas issue, and that is transgender athletes and women and girls sports. We've seen your campaign and other groups supporting your campaign run many ads on this. You even pitched a state ban. As somebody who champions individual freedoms, Why not let the high school athletic association's policy stay in place, or individual school districts attack this issue or address this issue?
Well, I think it's a matter of fundamental fairness. I mean, this is not a partisan issue. It's not political. I talk to Republicans, Democrats from big cities, small towns in Kansas. It cuts across all of those lines. At the end of the day, it is just Kansas common sense that people who are biologically male should not be competing in sports that are reserved for people who are biologically female athletes.
Is that worthy of a state ban? Because this doesn't seem to be a widespread issue in the state of Kansas.
Well, I think if you talk with those people who have worked so hard over their lives, female athletes, they move into a competition that they've worked years to prepare for, and then in some cases, as we've seen in some states, they wind up losing out to somebody who came up in a very different path that is sort of outside the common sense mainstream how we approach these issues. The answer to your question is yes. There are 18 states that have gone down this road, and I think we ought to be one who joins them.
You've been endorsed by former President Trump. In 2020, you signed on to a lawsuit with other attorneys general to delay certification of the election results in some states. Would you do that, given what you know now, there not being any evidence of widespread voter fraud?
Well, I've had a lot of support from a lot of folks all over the country and the state, and I'm proud to have all of that Republican support from Bob Dole to others. In terms of the election issue, here's my take on it. There is an important constitutional question that we have been raising since long before the voting occurred in the fall of 2020. The courts declined to answer it. I still think it needs to be answered about the interaction between the federal Constitution and the role of state institutions. And I'm very pleased that the U.S. Supreme Court has now finally agreed to hear that question and resolve it in a North Carolina case.
If you don't win, will you respect the outcome of the election?
Well, yes, of course.
The last debate, you seemed to open the door to the possibility of medical marijuana. Tell me a little bit about that, and what would the factors have to be for you to go along with something like that?
Right. My view on this has always been that I would prefer not to go down the road of legalizing illegal drugs. In my line of work, I see a lot of harm that's caused by addiction and by the illegal drug market in our state. I recognize that mores are changing, and that in particular with respect to a very narrow slice of individuals, veterans with PTSD, for example, kids with seizure disorders, late-stage cancer patients, that there is widespread public support for allowing bona fide doctors to prescribe this sort of intervention as they would any other controlled substance. And so I think the challenge is, how do we allow that to happen, because public opinion will ultimately make this decision, without flinging open the door so that Kansas begins to look more like a Colorado or an Oklahoma, where that really was just a camel's nose for recreational use, which I strongly oppose. So my view is, I think we can have that conversation if that's where our legislature wants to go. I think it's essential that law enforcement be meaningfully at the table for that, because they're the people on the front lines who deal with the consequences of the illicit trade in narcotics on our streets every day. And I think we see how we can get that done.
All right, Attorney General Derek Schmidt, thanks for your time.
Thank you very much. Appreciate it.